بحبك يا لبنان 2020.
وجوب تسهيل مهمة رئيس الحكومة.
إن هذه المعادلة المصر قد ماتت على يد حزب الله بالذات.
We are prepared to strike whenever we choose.
Good afternoon. It is Saturday, September 7th. I'm Yumna Naupal, and these are today's headlines. The case for Syria. John Kerry attempts to rally support from EU countries as Obama urges lawmakers in Washington to back the military strike. In the south of France, President Michel Sleiman meets with Lebanon's delegation to the francophone games, saying the youth resisted Israel and defeated terrorism through the army. And 2 people are killed in skirmishes as supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi thronged Egypt's cities and towns for the 3rd time in 8 days. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is meeting EU ministers to rally support for military strikes against Syria after the G20 summit failed to resolve bitter international divisions on the issue. Kerry is expected to press the case for punitive action against Syria after what the United States says was a chemical weapons attack by the regime of President Bashar al-Assad near Damascus. Meanwhile, inaction is not an option for the United States in Syria after the horrendous attack. These are the words of U.S. President Barack Obama as he's urging holdout lawmakers to back the military strike. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will seek to rally EU support for military strikes against Syria after the G20 summit failed to resolve bitter divisions between Washington and Moscow. Kerry is to press the case for punitive action against Syria after what the United States says was a chemical weapons attack by the regime of President Bashar al-Assad near Damascus, despite a lingering deep split among global powers. Kerry is to hold talks with the European Union's 28 foreign ministers in Lithuania, which currently holds the EU's rotating chair, with the bloc itself sharply split. Only France has said it is ready to take part in military action, while Britain, whose parliament voted against any involvement, and Denmark have expressed support. France was one of 4 European nations, with Britain, Italy and Spain, that signed a statement on Friday at the G20 meeting calling for a strong international response to the chemical attack widely attributed to the Assad regime. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, says that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad had barely dented his stockpile of chemical weapons in the alleged attack near Damascus last month. Speaking at the Center for American Progress think tank in Washington, D.C., she said all alternatives to military action have been exhausted.
We believe that this one attack in Damascus claimed more than 1,400 lives, far more than even the worst attacks by conventional means in Syria. And we assess that although Assad used more chemical weapons on August 21 than he had before, he has barely put a dent in his enormous stockpile, and the international community has clearly not yet put a dent in his willingness to use them. If the violation of a universal agreement to ban chemical weapons is not met with a meaningful response, other regimes will seek to acquire or use them to protect or extend their power, increasing risks to American troops in the future. We cannot afford to signal to North Korea and Iran that the international community is unwilling to act to prevent proliferation or willing to tolerate the use of weapons of mass destruction. The international system that was founded in 1945, a system we designed specifically to respond to the kinds of horrors we saw play out in World War II, has not lived up to its promise or its responsibilities in the case of Syria. And it is naive to think that Russia is on the verge of changing its position and allowing the UN Security Council to assume its rightful role as the enforcer of international peace and security.
A resolution drafted by a U.S. Senate committee authorizing the use of limited military action against Syria in response to the chemical weapons attack in August was delivered to the full Senate for its consideration and a vote, probably sometime next week. Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, announced receipt of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee resolution, but gave no indication of how swiftly the measure would proceed through the legislative process. The Senate will consider the measure first, and then the House of Representatives. A Democratic aide said that Reid is guardedly optimistic that the Senate will approve limited military strike against Syria. The aide said the first Senate vote will likely be held on Wednesday. And returning from his trip to Sweden and the G20 meetings in Russia, U.S. President Barack Obama arrived on board Air Force One at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland before traveling to the White House on Marine One. Obama's address to the nation from the White House on Tuesday will be part of a rejuvenated lobbying effort on Syria as Congress returns to Washington next week from summer recess. But speaking in Russia at the conclusion of the G20 summit, Obama acknowledged on Friday he faces an uphill fight to build public and congressional support for the military response to the Syrian government's alleged use of chemical weapons.
Assad's regime's brazen use of chemical weapons isn't just a Syrian tragedy. It's a threat to global peace and security. Syria's escalating use of chemical weapons threatens its neighbors: Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel. It threatens to further destabilize the Middle East. It increases the risk that these weapons will fall into the hands of terrorist groups. But more broadly, it threatens to unravel the international norm against chemical weapons embraced by 189 nations, and those nations represent 98% of the world's people. Failing to respond to this breach of this international norm would send a signal to rogue nations, authoritarian regimes, and terrorist organizations that they can develop and use weapons of mass destruction and not pay a consequence. I would greatly prefer working through multilateral channels and through the United Nations to get this done. But ultimately, what I believe in even more deeply, because I think that the security of the world and my particular task, looking out for the national security of the United States, requires that when there's a breach this brazen of a norm this important, and the international community is paralyzed and frozen and doesn't act, then that norm begins to unravel.
President Michel Sleiman met with Lebanon's delegation to the francophone games in southern France, saying Lebanese youth resisted Israel and defeated terrorism through the army. Lebanese youth have the will and have been capable of making wider achievements than any other country, Sleiman told the delegation that is participating in the games in the coastal city of Nice. They resisted Israel and were able, through the Lebanese army, to defeat terrorism too, Sleiman said. He will take part in the opening of the 2013 games and is scheduled to hold separate talks with President François Hollande and Abdou Diouf, Francophonie Secretary General. He has been accompanied by his First Lady, Wafa, Caretaker Deputy Prime Minister Samir Mukbel, Caretaker Culture Minister Gabi Layoun, and a Lebanese delegation. Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah have joined a military operation room to coordinate closely in the event of a U.S. strike on Syria, with Hezbollah mobilizing tens of thousands of fighters, senior political and diplomatic sources revealed to the Daily Star. Even though the U.S. has so far succeeded in keeping the axis of the resistance guessing about the targets and scope of the strike, the sources said Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah have geared up for the worst-case scenarios. While nearly every aspect of the expected U.S.-led strike remains in flux, the three players have agreed on a specific course of action if American missiles smash into Syrian territory. The sources said that Iran and Hezbollah would throw their weight and military skills behind President Bashar al-Assad if the strike presented a serious threat to the regime or would significantly weaken the Syrian army. Short of that, one diplomat said, Hezbollah and Iran are unlikely to get involved. The U.S. is ramping up its diplomatic efforts in Lebanon ahead of a potential military strike in Syria, withdrawing embassy staff while reassuring the Lebanese government that it would protect it from fallout across the border. The measures come amid fears that U.S. interests may be under threat if planned strikes against the regime of President Bashar al-Assad go ahead. The U.S. State Department asked its non-emergency staff and their family members to leave Lebanon, citing security concerns. In a separate statement, the State Department said it approved the drawdown of non-emergency personnel and family members who wish to leave Turkey's Adana. Given the current tensions in the region, as well as potential threats to U.S. government facilities and personnel, the State Department said it was taking these steps out of an abundance of caution to protect employees and their families. And the United Nations aid chief says that Lebanon, where Syrians now comprise 20% of the population, is in need of more support from the international arena. We are strong advocates for international support and will continue to be, UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergencies Valerie Amos said, noting the number of refugees needed aid that has increased considerably. As part of a series of meetings with officials, Amos discussed the refugee crisis with caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati, who expressed his concern that Syrians now comprise 20% of the population and that this was taking a toll on social services as well as the economy. She said Mikati informed her that the government was putting together a study to review the extent of economic losses caused by the refugee presence. She noted that there were two sides appealing for donor funds, the government and the UNHCR with its partner agencies. Coming up next, the Catholic Church calls for a global day of fasting and prayer for peace in Syria. Stay with us. We'll be back with more. Two people were killed in skirmishes as supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi thronged Egypt's cities and towns for the third time in 8 days, trying to rattle an army-backed government bent on crushing his Muslim Brotherhood. But the authorities, who have killed hundreds of Morsi supporters and arrested most of its top leaders, pressed on with a campaign to neutralize Egypt's biggest political movement with a decision to clip its legal status. Far from returning to normality after the army's overthrow of Morsi on July 3rd, following mass protests, the Arab world's most populous nation has remained on edge in fear of violence. That fear was also reinforced on Thursday when Interior Minister Mohammed Ibrahim survived a presumed suicide car bomb targeting his convoy, the culmination of a series of militant attacks. The Catholic Church has called for a global day of fasting and prayer for peace in Syria and against any armed intervention, with Pope Francis scheduled to host a mass vigil on St. Peter's Square. The Argentine Pope has called for a cry for peace from the world's 1.2 billion Catholics, Christians as a whole, believers from other faiths, and atheists. Syria's Grand Mufti Ahmad Badruddin Hassoun has also called for Syrians to join in the prayers, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I, the spiritual leader of the world's Orthodox, has said he is also backing the initiative. A giant peace flag will also be raised in Assisi, the hometown of the patron saint of peace, St. Francis, whose name the Pope adopted when he was elected in March. And now for news around the world in brief. At least 10 people have been killed in the Somali capital Mogadishu after two explosions ripped through a busy parking lot. Police and witnesses say the first blast was a car laden with explosive that was parked by a restaurant close to the theater. The second blast, which followed minutes later, was a suicide bomber who blew himself up in the crowd of civilians who rushed to the scene of the first blast. This is according to a Somali government security official. The vote counting begins in Australia as the Conservative leader, Tony Abbott, is headed for a landslide election victory. Australian voters seem to have punished Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's Labor government for 6 years of turbulent rule and for failing to maximise a now fading mining boom. Labor dumped Rudd in 2010 for Australia's first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, only to reinstate him as a leader in June 2013 in a desperate bid to stay in power. Voters in the Maldives thronged polling stations to choose a new leader 20 months after their first democratically elected president was ousted, causing months of sporadic violence and uncertainty. Mohamed Nasheed, forced from power in February of 2012 in what his supporters say was a coup, hopes to return to office and end a period of unrest that has tarnished the Indian Ocean's archipelago's image as a tropical holiday paradise. He cast his vote in the city center near police headquarters. Jostled by reporters, Nasheed was whisked to the front of the queue by bodyguards and then quickly out of the polling station. And hundreds of Japanese people join a public sports event at Tokyo's Olympic Park ahead of the International Olympic Committee's vote in Buenos Aires to select the host city of the 2020 Summer Games. Tokyo is battling Madrid and Istanbul as all three cities wrestle with challenges that threaten to rule them out of winning the right to stage the Games. Tokyo hosted the Summer Games in 1964 but failed to beat Rio de Janeiro for the right to host the 2016 Olympics. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our stories. The case for Syria, John Kerry attempts to rally support from EU countries as Obama urges holdout lawmakers in Washington to back a military strike. In the south of France, President Michel Sleiman meets with Lebanon's delegation to the francophone Games, saying the youth resisted Israel and defeated terrorism through the army. And 2 people are killed in skirmishes as supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi thronged Egypt's cities and towns for the 3rd time in 8 days. Those are your Saturday headlines live on Future Television in Beirut. I'm Yumna Naufal, wishing you a good weekend.
حبك يا لبنان 2020.
وجوب تسهيل مهمة رئيس الحكومة.
إن هذه المعادلة المصر قد ماتت على يد حزب الله بالذات.
We are prepared to strike whenever we choose.